Hello and welcome to this episode of Just a Few. Again, my name is Patrick Antwine, and as usual, it's an opportunity for me to respond to a question about a biblical issue or about the church and the Christian faith. Today's question has to do with something that is known as the Star of David. And let me jump into the question. Does the Bible mention anything about a Star of David? And is there any relationship between that and the stars that people put on top of Christmas trees? Wow, quite a bit there. So it's a two-part question, but it relates to the same issue. Let me look at this from this perspective. In the Bible, there is absolutely nothing said about a Star of David. It is not something mentioned in the Bible. There are sects within the Orthodox Jewish community who have always sought to provide mystic explanations about the shields that David used, and that's where the star concept came from and so on. But in terms of the Bible itself, no. History also tells us that around the end of the 19th century, around 1897, when the Jews began to regather with a passion to go back to their ancestral homeland, they adopted this 6-point star that they claim is the Star of David as their national symbol. Even to this day, you see a star as the central part of the emblem on the flag of modern day Israel. But no, there's nothing in the Bible that talks about a Star of David. Keep in mind, however, that stars have always been a fascination of people, not just astrologers, in ancient cultures, in many different cultures, because they symbolize some sort of divine guidance, this concept of stars providing guidance. And the only thing that I've found in the Bible that has to do with a star is in a very negative light, and it's actually a bit of a warning for us who may think that there's nothing, that it's just harmless, it's part of our culture to put a star on top of a Christmas tree. Some time ago I did a video, it's on my YouTube channel, about should Christians celebrate Christmas. So if you have not seen that before, I'll leave a link for it. If you're looking at this on YouTube, I'll leave a link in the description below. But let's look at something about the ancient Jewish people, that God condemned certain practices that they engaged in involving stars. And I'm speaking about what God spoke through the prophet Amos, and it's a very reference that Stephen picked up on in his last sermon that he preached in the book of Acts chapter 7. But first, let's go to the book of Amos chapter 5. We are familiar with what went on in the wilderness. Most of us, if we are familiar reading the book of Exodus, when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, they brought their idols with them, the gods that they worshipped in Egypt. And one of the famous and dominant gods that was worshipped in Egypt was Apis, the bull. And so they made a golden calf in the days of Aaron and they worshipped it. But that was not the only thing that they worshipped during those 40 years in the wilderness. And God, through the prophet Amos, reminded the Jews of that day about that. Amos chapter 5 verse 26 says, God says, you also carried Sikuth, your king, your idol, your pagan deity, and Kiun, your idols, the star of your gods, which you made for yourselves. So they also made gods whose emblem was a star. The Jewish people did that. And God condemned them and said, in the wilderness, you all carried these emblems, these stars of the gods, the pagan deities that they worshipped. So this was way back then. Of course, in that other video I told you about, in Jeremiah chapter 10, it talked about them cutting down trees and picking up branches and bringing them into their homes and decorating them. And part of that whole ancient Yuletide celebration involved placing a star at the top of the tree, which is still practiced in Celtic and other cultures today. When we put up a Christmas tree, we don't know why, but we just put up this star. Well, that was part of the whole ancient practice associated with what was condemned here by God. The children of Israel did this in the wilderness. Stephen, in preaching his sermon in Acts chapter 7, went back to that same incident to warn the people of his day that their ancestors always rejected God and turned to idols. Verse 41 to 43 of Acts 7. And they made a calf in those days, we're familiar with that, offered sacrifices to the idol, and rejoiced in the work of their own hands. Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven. God allowed them to go after the pagan deities that they wanted to worship. As it is written in the book of the prophets, did you offer me slaughtered animals and sacrifices during 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You also took up the tabernacle of Moloch, also called Molech, and the star of your god, and Stephen used a Greek form of the word, Remphan, images which you made to worship, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. So this god that Stephen refers to as Remphan, his symbol was a star, and they carried this star with them wherever they went, all through the wilderness, and God was mindful of it so that they were not faithful to God. So be careful with your understanding of the origin of this star. It was part of the pagan, it was at the center of pagan worship in ancient time because it always associated with some sort of divine guidance. So when you put up a Christmas tree, if you choose to do so, and you put that star up there, don't be fooled into thinking it's a star of David, this is the star that the wise men followed and so on. So we have a way of trying to sanitize things that have pagan origins and think, well, put a little biblical spin on it. Be very careful with that. Remember these verses here, that this whole question of carrying this star and the decoration of trees and so on in Jeremiah chapter 10, it all had Babylonian and pagan origin. God talks about the way of the Gentiles. So be very careful with that. Understand there's history behind things, and as one person who I spoke to subsequent to doing that video about Christmas, had a healthy conversation with that person, and you can't take something that is basically pagan and say you have a different meaning for it. You can't do that. If it has a pagan origin, you cannot sanitize it and say, well, it means something differently. You're kind of playing smart with foolishness. So we, as Christians today, we have a very, very tight rope to try to walk on between pagan culture, things of pagan origin, and things that are modern culture, as well as things that seem to be biblical but may not be. So let me close off by saying, no, there's nothing about a star of David in the Bible. There's a star of Remphan, which was pagan, and remember, a lot of pagan things, people try to reintroduce them by repackaging them. And we can just fall right into it and say, well, it means so and so to us. Be very careful with that. And that's all I could say about it. No, there is no such thing mentioned in the Bible about a star of David, and don't associate that concept with the star of Bethlehem and the star that the Magi followed. And so you can be mixing truth with error, paganism with something that you think is biblical and might not even be biblical. My name is Patrick Antwine. I hope this helped a bit. And I know I might have made it as clear as muddy water there for some people, and it has raised a lot of other issues, but I tried my best to answer the question. Thank you for the question. If you have a question and you would like to submit it for me to provide a response, use the email on the screen and I'll try to respond as soon as I can. Until then, shalom.